Thank you for coming on tonight's tour. My name is Bruce Barnes from the New Bedford Preservation Society, and we're doing the Historic District tonight. Which is, I haven't done the Historic District in a long time, especially since the Park Service has free tours on a regular basis. But I think that our tour is going to be pretty interesting, talking about mostly what the Whaling National Park has to offer, and the history of the city really begins here as a major commercial center. Lots to talk about here. And we're starting here at the Customs House, built in mid-1830s. By the time the Customs House was built in the 1830s, New Bedford really was booming at the time from the whaling industry. Hundreds of ships were being sent across the oceans of the world to collect whale oil from sperm whales for the most part. And when they brought it back, the government obviously gets its take from duties and so forth. The Customs House was designed by a man by the name of Robert Mills. He was a government architect, pretty famous architect from the South Carolina. His most famous commission is the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. So he wasn't a small-timer. He was an important architect at the time. There were other architects designing in this exact style in New Bedford. This is the building he did, but it looks kind of similar to the stone houses on County Street and so forth. The building is in the Greek Revival style. Looks like a Greek temple. Beautiful columns, beautiful stonework on this particular building. It doesn't have its cupola anymore, although it was called an observatory when it was built. But when we get away from the building, you see there's four chimneys. Actually, those four structures that are on the roof are chimneys. And there was a glassed-in building with windows up there at one time. It looks like a cupola. They called it an observatory. Another interesting part about this building when it was built, and it was made aware to me when I was giving a tour to the Victorian Society, and the man who was leading that tour was very, very knowledgeable. His name was Richard Guy Wilson, a very important architectural historian working at the University of Virginia. And he told me that this building was built with fireproofing. And I didn't know how that could be, actually. But we were walking around after lunch, and he said, you know, this building was built with fireproofing. You know, I'd like to see it. And I said, well, why don't we just walk in and ask if we can see it? If it still exists, whatever that was, however they did this, you know. And they did. They said, yeah, go ahead. You can see it in the back of the building. The building was also the post office when it was built in the 1830s. So there's the back of the building isn't really occupied anymore. And they have this kind of odd baffling of the ceiling and the walls and so forth, which was built to contain a fire. There had been a lot of wood fires in cities, and when one building started to burn, they spread quite a bit. So this wasn't a fireproofing in the sense of keeping the building from burning down, but keeping the building that was burning from spreading. That's basically what that was all. But it's an interesting feature. It's in this particular building. Now, many people, when we go on the tours, when we're doing the big houses and some of the other grand buildings in town, they've asked, where did the granite come from? Now, and I always say, well, you know, Fall River had a huge quarry. Lots of the granite from the buildings in New Bedford came from the big quarries in Fall River. But the government being the government, this granite came from Hallowell, Maine. Hallowell, Maine, which is near Augusta. We're not talking about, you know, a port city, you know, where they could just float it down, you know, the river, the ocean, and get it here. No, Hallowell, Maine. So even though there was quarries all around, they specified this very remote granite for this particular building. Any questions about the Customs House? My final point about the Customs House and customs and tariffs that they collected here. For all the years of the early Republic, from the time of the Constitution in the 1780s till the Civil War, the entire government, the United States federal government, was funded by tariffs and duties collected at the Customs House. There were no income taxes. There was no other types of taxes like that. All the funding for the federal government, this is Congress, the military, all those types of things, was funded by tariffs and duties collected at customs houses across the country. on this site, right next to the Customs House, all the way to Acushnet Avenue, was built in 1892 and opened in 1893, a United States Post Office. If you follow us on Facebook, we put teasers up on what is this building and where was the eagle that I'll show you where it is on Elm Street at the top of this particular structure. The post office was built, again, it was a government contract, government lawyer, government architect built it here. It wasn't a particularly attractive building. When you look at it in pictures, it kind of looks like a squat pumpkin, actually. You know, kind of big and round, peak. It has a style that's not too different from the first floor of the Freestones now, big arches and so forth. Wasn't a particularly attractive building, and it wasn't very functional either. The city was growing at a tremendous pace in the 1890s, and it was obsolete within about 15 years. And in the early decade of the 20th century, we built the new post office that currently is the post office in New Bedford on Pleasant Street. So the building was obsolete. It was a postal annex for a while, and it served lots of other purposes. But it had an A-frame arch over the front entrance, which was right about here, I would guess, right in the middle of the building. And at the top of that A-frame was a carved stone eagle, about 6 feet tall, on about a 6 foot tall base. So when they were demolishing the building in 1955, they hired a person. Apparently the interior of the building was beautifully appointed. Tons of beautiful marble, lots of woodwork, and the demolition company was going to salvage all that stuff. But the eagle was too difficult to bring down, and because people wanted to save the eagle. Town wanted to save the eagle. And in an article in 1955, they had this headline that said, "Eagle doomed on demolition of post office." We'll post the headline of that on the video when we put the video out. So it looked like the eagle wasn't going to be saved, but because he said the salvager said he had offers to buy the eagle, but it would have taken too much money even to take it down. But somehow it was saved. The eagle was saved. He made appearances at various buildings and so forth throughout the city over the years. He had a nickname, Mr. Steadfast. That was his nickname. He was in front of the old Channel, I don't remember this myself, but I guess he was in front of the Channel 6 building on County Street. He was other places. Spent a lot of years in the yard, the New Bedford yard, amongst the weeds and so forth. But he's survived. And they beautifully installed, the city did something really good. They installed him at the end of Elm Street. We can see him from a distance if you're not familiar with Mr. Steadfast, but he still lives as a nice monument to the city, really, down there at the Elm and the highway. So that's the story about the library here and Mr. Steadfast, who, thank God, did survive the demolition. The two buildings across the street built as banks. The Freestones building, you can see, says Citizens National Bank, built as a bank in the late 1880s and finished in 1891. And the Visitor Center, which was originally the New Bedford Institution for Savings, and built in the 1850s. Now, the only point I want to make about these two buildings is their use of brownstone. Everybody's heard about brownstone, Brooklyn brownstones, and the brownstones in various neighborhoods in New York and so forth. The facade here is brownstone. It doesn't refer to the brick. It refers to this stone right here. And on the Visitor Center, the facade is brownstone as well. Two different tones of brownstone. It was a very highly desirable building material, decorative building material in the years before, especially before the Civil War, but particularly afterwards. A lot of brownstone on the Grace Church was built in the 1880s. Lots of brownstone's been used since then, but it was used a lot in the years before the Civil War. And a lot of the brownstone is quarried in Connecticut. The town of Portland, Connecticut, which is right across the river from Middletown, if you know anything about Connecticut, there's a big giant quarry that was there. I think probably the brownstone from the bank building came from that particular quarry. I'm not sure about this here. And if you've driven from Middletown in Connecticut, which is about halfway between Long Island Sound and Hartford on Route 9, and you drove straight across to 91 and or 84 on the highway there, you'll see outcroppings that look just like this stone on the way over. Lots of brownstone in Connecticut. Probably, I'm pretty sure that this probably came from Portland, Connecticut, and this may have come in well because there was a lot of brownstone in Connecticut that was quarried. But there are other parts of the country too that where you could get it, and as we know, sometimes they didn't go to the easiest source to get their building materials, as we noted here. Any questions about that? Yes?
So when did this become a courthouse?
It was a courthouse after the New Bedford Institution for Savings built a beautiful bank where the Oceanarium was.
Yeah.
That's the next building. So after that, it became the 3rd District Court. And then it was all kinds of things after that. It was a junk dealer for a while. When I worked in New Bedford in the library in the 1970s, it was a junk shop, and then it was an auto parts shop for a while at that time as well. So it's been a lot of things. But the bank repurchased the building, if you remember, turned it into a bank again for a short time before the Park Service bought it. This beautiful Federal style house, built in the 1820s, has been referred to as the Benjamin Rodman House all its restored existence. It's a misnomer. This house was actually the second building of Samuel Rodman Senior. We're going to talk about him at the site of his first house. This is the site of the second house. Built this house in the 1820s, documented a number of times in like the Roaches and a couple of other primary sources that Samuel Rodman built this as his second house in the 1820s. For some reason, and I think I know the reason, when they first did the research on this house in the 60s and 70s, they probably used the first New Bedford directory, which came out in 1836. Samuel Senior died in 1835, and I think the directory listed his son Benjamin as living in the house, and that's where it came from. Because Benjamin probably lived briefly in the house, but he was a big landowner in another part of town. His mother, Elizabeth Rodman, who was the subject of the VIP tour, I talked about her at length on that tour. She lived in the house after her husband died, and in fact sold the land to the bank. This was Rodman land, and they sold the land for the bank in her lifetime. So it says Benjamin Rodman, but it's actually Samuel Rodman Jr.'s second house. It's one of the first houses built of granite in New Bedford. They're not the first, but a lot of the early houses, big mansions, were built of brick or brick with wood facades, like the Mariner's home we're going to talk about in a little while. But nonetheless, it's one of the first of the nice stone mansions built in the city. One of the few mansions in the historic districts that hasn't been moved to its location. Many of the other big houses have in fact been moved from one spot to another. But anyway, it's a beautiful house, nice fanlight window over the front door, and just a nicely detailed building. If anybody recalls what this building looked like in the 60s, it had storefronts built all around it. It was a total mess, really. But we managed to save that. Preservation is one of the early preservation jobs in New Bedford on an old house. They took all the storefronts away from the front and restored the building. It was originally going to be, and was the home of the Glass Museum, the New Bedford Glass Museum. That's one of the reasons they restored the house, because they had a commitment from the Glass Museum to move into the site. They did move into it for a while. I don't know how that didn't work out. I knew some of the participants and who made that happen, but I don't know why it failed, but it did fail. But anyway, beautiful house still. I actually have not been in this building. Has anybody been in this building that they can recall? But anyway, it's beautiful on the outside, but nicely preserved. The building behind me was the home of Andrew Robeson. And he was a pretty interesting guy. again, before I forget, this house was also moved. It was directly opposite the house originally. Now you got a picture, 1820s. Not much development here. This is in the 1820s. This is still a fairly residential area. Customs house isn't here. Nothing's here except a few residences on these sites. His house was directly opposite the house we were just at, but almost backed up to Cushnet Avenue. So he had a big garden in front. He owned all this block, and he had a nice big garden in front, Andrew Robeson. He was born in the late 1780s. He married into the Rodman family, married a daughter of Samuel Rodman Senior, and he got involved. He was a pioneer in the Fall River textile industry. He lived in this house. He was a printer of fabrics. That was his claim to fame. The finishing of woven goods was a cottage industry actually before the 1820s, when people like Robeson got involved with mass printing of woven products, woven cotton and wool. And he set up a factory in Fall River, not too far from where the government center in Fall River is. If you drive through the highway on the west side of the government center, just about below there, he had a big factory, and he printed cotton and wool cloth. And it was really kind of revolutionary for the area. He made a fortune. He made a fortune doing this. Now, he lived here the whole time, and I just read a little bio about him preparing for this particular tour. And in that bio it says that he commuted every day from his house, which would have been over here, but even if it was here, from here to Fall River, every day. He took a route that either went through the head of Westport, which is Old County Road, Old Westport Road, or Hicksville, which is Old Fall River, Old Bedford Road. And I thought, that must have taken him. He said he had fast horses and so forth and a nice buggy, blah, blah, blah. But it must have taken him to take that route on the on the lousy roads that were there at the time. It must have taken him 2 hours each way, had to have. He couldn't have gone, he couldn't have driven the horses that fast, even though he said in the article he had fabulously fast horses and so forth. But nonetheless, I knew he had commuted from previous things I had read, but I figured he went on a Monday and came back on a Saturday or something like that, or Friday. No, it said in this book distinctly, and it was a person who probably knew that it was true, that he would commute every day by one-horse buggy to and fro. He was heavily involved in the whaling industry as well. When you look at the Whaleman Shipping List, which is a list of all a weekly newspaper that made a list of all the whale ships that went out, he owned a number of whalers as well. There was a little booklet that came out every other year or so. I don't know who published it, but it was the richest men in Massachusetts. And he was at the top of the list a couple of times. And in New Bedford, we had some very wealthy people. James Arnold and the Rodmans and Roaches and so forth. But he was at the top, and John Avery Parker, he was at the top of the list a couple of times for his work as a pioneer in the textile industry and also in the whaling industry. Andrew Robeson died in 1862. He had a grandson that was killed at the Battle of Gettysburg. So these were people that were committed in more ways than one. Seamen's Bethel, probably the most iconic building in the district, immortalized by Herman Melville in Moby Dick, built in the 1830s originally. It was a Greek revival style, and but had a major fire in the 1860s and sort of remodeled it. Has more Gothic features now, I think, than it did. Anyway, beautiful building, lots of history. When Melville came here in December of 1840, it was been the old style building, but nonetheless, there wasn't too many changes. And the cenotaphs that were inside at that time as well. The building was only 8 years old when he came here, but the marble monuments inside were there already. Now, the Seamen's Bethel was a brainchild of the rich people in New Bedford as something for the transient sailors that came to New Bedford on an annual basis. Now, by the 1830s, New Bedford probably had 300 ships in service, whaling. And each ship had a crew of about 30 people. And because they had the whaleboats, each whaleboat had 6 people, it's about 30 people on each whaleboat, each whale ship. And probably 2/3 of them were people from kids from the farmland, well away from New Bedford by that time. The only locals that were involved at the industry being the captains and the mates and probably like the cooks and so forth. But most of the regular seamen were not from New Bedford. They were transients. Probably as many as 8,000-9,000 transients would come and go from New Bedford during these years. And by the 1830s, in this section of town, there was a lot of temptation. And so, which was, and we'd had some issues with that in New Bedford with prostitution in the past in this area. So they wanted to build something that would perhaps help people to come and feel a little bit more welcome. And that's what the Port Society, New Bedford Port Society, which still exists, I believe, was all about. For the welfare of these transient seamen who were young boys and men, for the most part, from other parts of the country, and they wanted to make sure that they didn't stray too far from the straight and narrow. The bowsprit pulpit in the building, which is described in Moby Dick, is not original to either one of the versions of the building. That was a figment of Melville's imagination, a nice touch. And over the years, there's 2 or 3 versions of when the bowsprit pulpit was put in. I don't know which one is accurate, haven't studied it that much, but that's a fairly recent invention based on the description that Melville made in Moby Dick. The Mariners' Home, again, the date's wrong. It's built in 1790. It's been documented any number of places that they built the house in 1790. It was the first house of William Rotch Senior. William Rotch Senior was grandson of the founder of the Rotch Whaling House, originally from Nantucket. They're the ones, the Rotch family, the ones who moved to New Bedford in the years just prior to the American Revolution in the 1760s and established a whaling branch of their business here. It was thrived for a number of years before the American Revolution. The Revolution did bad damage to the whaling industry in New Bedford. The British came and basically burned all the commercial buildings during the American Revolution. And William Rotch Senior was assigned to come to New Bedford and rebuild what had been destroyed. And he did so magnificently. He was a very, very important man in New Bedford. Established all sorts of civic and cultural organizations. He was the founder of the Friends Academy. The same Friends Academy that now exists on Tucker Road was a building that was on County Street, and it was the brainchild of William Rotch Jr. and Samuel Rodman Senior, who we're going to talk about in detail in a little while. When Rotch died, the house really wasn't here originally. It was on Water Street. They just moved it straight back to this location in a year or so after Rotch died in 1850. His daughter, Sarah Arnold, who was James Arnold, the Wamsutta Club Arnolds, she inherited the building, gave it to the Port Society at that time, and for 100 years or more was used as a home for transient mariners. They could stay in the Mariners. That's why it's called the Mariners' Home. Pat just described how it's occupied now, but it was a Mariners' Home into to recent years actually. The building is a brick building with a wood facade. Yep, you could see the brick. If you go around the corner, you can see the brick structure. RJD, which is William Rotch Jr.'s second house, is a brick building that's completely rebuilt with a wood cladding. So it looks like a wood house, and it is a wood house in a sense, but its structure, foundation, its framing and stuff isn't framing, is brick. Very unusual. I mean, but that's how they engineered those houses in those days. They hadn't really used the balloon style. Well, anyway, the building techniques got better as they got along. Anyway, beautiful building, kind of plain. This three-story mansion style was very popular in New Bedford until the 1820s. Lots of houses were like this. When you look at the old history books of houses in New Bedford, they were built in the 1780s, early 1800s. They look very similar to this with very just small detailing where the differences was sort of the style in New Bedford was a very plain Quaker influenced style, I believe. In the late 1880s and early 1890s, the city of Chicago planned a spectacular World's Fair. It was to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the Columbus discovery of America. It was called the Columbian Exhibition. And it took place, actually, it didn't take place in 1892, but 1893. It was the greatest World's Fair that the United States has ever sponsored. It was absolutely magnificent. And there were huge exhibits for all sorts of things, industry, commerce, arts, and all sorts of things. And the states had their own buildings, and the cities were also invited to make an exhibit, a special exhibit, if they wanted to do so. And New Bedford was a fairly important city at the time in the country, more so than now as far as having national significance. And New Bedford was invited to make to have an exhibit, a special exhibit at this World's Fair in Chicago. Well, the textile industry was booming at the time. New mills were going up all over the place, a tremendous amount of investment. People were proud of the fact that we had this new way of doing business, the city was growing and so forth. But the city had other ideas. They decided to send a whale ship to this exhibit. Well, the textile men weren't thrilled about that, and they had a lot of power in the city, but nonetheless, the city held for them, and they refitted a whaler called the Progress. Strictly coincidental that the Progress would be used in this particular case. They fixed it up, outfitted it to the best they could. It looked like it was like a tip-top shaped whaler, sent it to Chicago. And it was the official exhibit for New Bedford at the Columbian Exhibition. The exhibition only lasted for 5 or 6 months. That was the only plan. It was the summer of 1893. The World's Fair took place. It was fabulously attended, and then it ended. And the city never retrieved the Progress. It just left it there. Well, in 1902, everybody sort of forgot about the Progress, and then somebody torched it at a dock in Chicago. And the paper, the Evening Standard at the time, wrote an article about the inglorious end of the Progress. What happened? Why did we leave it there? We just left it there to have somebody burn it down? It was very embarrassing. And it wasn't long after that, and I think there was a sentiment growing in the city that we had to preserve our whaling heritage. And they did, and so I don't know if the demise of the Progress, it was written up in the paper. You know, I think we'll probably post the headline that appeared in the paper on the video when Steve does the video. But it wasn't too long after that the Old Dartmouth Historical Society was formed in 1903, and then shortly thereafter they decided to put the Whaling Museum here. I think that it was just one of the pieces that made people think we can't lose that heritage. We got to start collecting it and remembering it, and and showing it off, and not just letting it die a death like the Progress did. So anyway, and the Whaling Museum, as we know it today, is one of the great museums. It's really jewel of the city. It's a fabulous collection. Everyone is proud of the museum. It has been a great museum for a long, long time. I remember even when I was a kid coming to New Bedford and everybody talked about the museum as a very special place, and it continues to be a special place. You know, in 1900, I think the whole whaling heritage thing was at risk, and thank God they saved it in time. This site behind you, to the corner, was the site of the original site of the Samuel Rodman Senior house. He had a large two-story federal style right on the corner here of Water Street, and when he built the house, really there was no William Street. It was just a dirt path. And his friend and brother-in-law, William Rotch Senior, lived in the Mariners' home, which is now right next door, right where that car is, right in that corner. They live side by side. The Roches Senior married William Rotch's sister, whose name was also Elizabeth, and they had two other siblings that married into the family. So they were very close commercially, and as well as in a family sense. Samuel Rodman Senior was born in Newport in the 1750s. His father was a seaman, but died at sea when Rodman was probably a teenager. He had a large group of brothers and sisters. He had a lot of siblings. And Samuel was taken in by the Rivera family in Newport, Rhode Island, where he was born and living. And the Riveras, one man by the name of Jacob Rivera, he had developed, during the time that Rodman was living there as a teenager, the formula for making spermaceti candles. Now, one of the products of sperm whales, other than the blubber for oil, is a substance called spermaceti, which is a waxy, oily substance in the head of the sperm whale. If you know if you can recall what a sperm whale looks like, it's got this big blocky head in front, and the head is filled with this substance, which the whalemen called spermaceti, and it was used for echolocation. Actually, I don't know what the chemistry or anatomy is, but it was different from blubber. And the spermaceti was used to make candles. And Jacob Rivera, while Samuel Rodman Senior was living with him as a youngster, had developed the best formula for making spermaceti candles. It was a closely held secret for many years because these candles were highly prized and long burning and bright and so forth, so they were very, very valuable commodity. So when Rodman came of age, he moved to Nantucket to make his fame and fortune, got hooked up with the Roches as a candle maker. He knew the formula. And so his specialty, even though when he moved to New Bedford, he moved to New Bedford with the rest of the Roches in the late 1790s, his specialty was candle making. And it's kind of apt. I mean, that wasn't the only thing he did. He was a whaling merchant of all kinds. He was involved in all the commercial interest banks and so forth that he did at the time. But it is apt that the one thing that's saved from Samuel Rodman Senior is the Candleworks he built in 1810, because that's what his specialty was. This building is interesting. Originally was only finished on two sides. He didn't want to waste money on sides that weren't going to be seen. So he finished these sides, but it's a nice building, very highly detailed for a factory. Basically, it's a factory building. It's not a house or anything, it's a factory building. He made candles in there. But anyway, Rodman Senior was an interesting guy. He really played second fiddle to his brother-in-law, William Rotch Senior, most of his life, but nonetheless, a very influential and important man in the early history of New Bedford. This is the Double Bank building. One of the great buildings in the city, built in the 1830s, designed by the architect Russell Warren, who was responsible for a lot of the big buildings in the city, the public library, the big stone mansions on County Street, a number of other buildings. He also was responsible for the Visitor Center actually as well. But these big, giant, monumental Greek buildings are a specialty here in New Bedford. He did a lot of them. It's called the Double Bank building because there were two banks that were built at the site. It was built for two separate banks. Now, the story goes that there were two separate contractors that built the building. And I really can't see it, but four of these columns are a little skinnier than four of the other ones. I gotta tell you, it's pretty hard to see. I guess a keen eye can see it, but I don't have a keen enough eye to see it. But four of the columns are skinnier than the other four. One of the reasons it's called double bank as well, because the columns are different. One of the beautiful things about the building as it sits today, one of the TV stations, I think it's Channel 10, has one of these cameras that's on the Regency building. And before the sun comes up, this building is lit up. And when they pan over the city on one of these cameras, this is the building that's lit up. It looks magnificent. It makes the whole city look like $1 million, really, because it's so beautiful. It's beautiful no matter where you look at it from, but it's really built beautiful when it's lit up like that from afar. Just a great building. Been lots of things. It was Wales office, I think, for a while, and it's been lots of things over the years. Hasn't been a bank building for quite a few years, over 100 years now. But nonetheless, thank God it's been saved. Again, there's a columns of all the columns in New Bedford, except the ones at the Customs House. Most of the columns on the big buildings were specified to be of wood and still are of wood. I mean, if you know when you knock on them and stuff, you can tell that they're wood. And that's how they were built and prescribed during stock. The Rotch Rodman House, the Grinnell Mansion, all those houses, the columns were wood. The Water Street, especially the east side of Water Street, really hasn't changed architecturally since it was built in the 1820s. And it's really kind of remarkable that it lasted, because this area of the city became very commercial at one point, and you would have thought that they would have been replaced, like a lot of the buildings on the west side of the street have been replaced. You know, there was the same types of buildings on both sides, but these buildings were replaced over time, and these weren't. So all of these buildings here that we see, and I'm not going to talk about any of them individually because it would take us forever, because they're all worthy of discussion, but they were all built mostly in the 1820s and 30s. Very authentic still. They look probably just like they did in the day, and it's great that they've all been saved. Now, the building across the street, for all those who went on the Howland Mill tour last year, or who have watched the video, this is the bank, this is the doorway that William D. Howland walked out that fateful day in 1897, empty-handed after asking for the final loan, which he knew if he didn't get, his mill would fail. Walked out that building, walked down these streets to his dock on North Street, and took his life that day. This is the National Bank of Commerce. I'm kind of disappointed, actually, that the Whaling Museum scratched off the name, because the name was there not too long ago. It said National Bank of Commerce. This was the first building. Henry Holliston Rogers, the famous man from Fairhaven, the rich man from Fairhaven, he bought the building after the bank went belly up, and then he gave it for a song to the Old Dartmouth Historical Society. This is their first building. It's often referred to as the Rogers Building, but to me, it'll be the National Bank of Commerce building because of the William D. Howland connection. This site here is a site that many of us will remember, actually. The famous gas explosion in 1977 took place right here at a place called O'Malley's Tavern. 1977 was a extremely cold winter that year. I was working in New Bedford actually at the time. I worked at the library, and we haven't had in recent memory the river completely freeze over beyond the dike. It's been so long since that's happened, but that was the case in 1977. The river was completely frozen over. It was common in old years, But that year, the river froze over. It froze over beyond the dike, in fact. There was even some wags in the paper was saying that if you were nimble enough, you could walk from Woods Hole to Martha's Vineyard on all the pack ice that particular winter, 1977. Anyway, on January 18th of 1977, there was a bar here called O'Malley's Tavern. And around 5 o'clock in the morning, a pipe cracked because it was so cold that it sort of froze things below what they expected them to freeze. Pipe cracked. When the furnace went on, a gigantic explosion happened on this site. It blew in the wall. It didn't destroy the wall, but it blew in the wall of the YMCA. There was all the windows around here shattered. The Whaling Museum lost all their windows in the Bourne building, all the windows. In fact, that big window you can see when you step back, completely shattered, and shards of glass were embedded in the sails of the Lagoda. Yep. It was an unbelievable explosion. That and the two buildings, the Sundial building and the building next to it, were on fire and burned. The Sundial building was restored from a Herculean effort by Whale, actually, to save that building because it was very badly destroyed. All the windows in the neighborhood were blown out. It was an unbelievable thing. The only good thing about the explosion was nobody was hurt. There was nobody on the street. There was nobody in the buildings. It's 5 o'clock in the morning, and nobody was around to get hurt, and no one was hurt. But it took them a long time to turn the gas off, turn the fires off. It was quite a day in January of 1977. On this site, the building faced Union Street was the Mansion House. If you follow us on Facebook, that's the last clue or the teaser. There's a picture of the Mansion House as it looked around probably 1880 or so. It was the home of William Rotch Senior. William Rotch Senior was one of the most important Yankee whalemen in history, actually. He was the son of the founder of the Rotch whaling firm. He mostly lived his life in Nantucket. He was the one that really made the whaling industry a international and huge money-making operation. He had to fend off. He wanted to maintain the industry's strength in Nantucket and with the family. And by the 1750s and 60s, whale oil was a very valuable commodity. Lots of money was being made harvesting and selling whale oil. So much so that, rich people from other areas of New England wanted a piece of the action. The Browns in Providence, John Hancock in Boston, they tried to get into the industry as middlemen trying to control the oil market. And it was William Rotch Senior in the 1760s and 70s who fended them all off to maintain control of the industry in Nantucket. He also set up a system. He set up the business as a vertical integration, which means he owned every aspect of the business. He owned the ships that went whaling. He owned the factories that refined the oil. He made the factories that sent the oil. He owned the ships that sent the oil. He owned every aspect of the Rotch family, and it was because of William Rotch Senior. He was born in 1734 and died in 1828, just to give you a time frame of when he was active. The American Revolution was not kind to the whaling industry because we were a colony of England. The deal was, the colony sent all the raw materials and goods to England, and we got, sent back whatever. And whale oil was one of the most important commodities: timber, tobacco, and whale oil. And so when the revolution started, we were favored trade status beforehand. All of a sudden, we were the enemy. And Rotch it's amazing how many trips he made back and forth from Nantucket to Europe, mostly England, to try to secure markets, try to sell product when it was the toughest time to do so, and he was somewhat successful. Just a remarkable man. After the Revolution, his son, William Rotch Senior, had established New Bedford as a very, very viable whaling port. It seemed he was getting old. He decided that he would just let his son take over the business. He moved his assets, all the assets that the Rotch family had, in Nantucket and settled here in the 1790s and built his home on this site. From day one, it was called, in about 1795. From day one, it was called the Mansion House. If you're familiar with that painting, New Bedford Four Corners, the Four Corners painting, everybody has seen that picture. He's in his house, he's the guy in the carriage, but his house is in the upper left corner around, with the poplars all around it. That's the Mansion House if you look at the Four Corners picture. He lived in the house until he passed away at 94 years old in 1828. He willed it to his daughter, Mary Rotch, but the house was too big for her. So she sold it, and for many years it was a famous hotel and restaurant. They added to the back of the house. So when you look at that picture, you'll see, boy, it really is big in the back. Those are all additions, rooms. They actually had used it as an office building as well. And it was a very famous building for many, many years, most of the 19th century, actually. But as time went on, this end of Union Street was not fashionable at all anymore. And it kind of fell into disrepute. And when it burned down in 1928, one of the newspapermen said, it wasn't a building that was frequented by reputable people. In other words, it was probably a brothel. It burned down to the ground in 1928, but when they demolished the remains and cleaned up the site, they did find some tunnels, blocked off, but tunnels that led to the waterfront. And there was speculation that they might have been Underground Railroad tunnels, or maybe even Shanghai tunnels for all we know. They didn't really follow up on it to figure out where they went, but there were tunnels underneath the house, underneath the Mansion House, that led to the waterfront. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next time.